We started this unit by looking at phylogenetic trees and cladograms because that is the way that we most often represent the process of evolution and show how all living things are related. And you're going to continue to see those tree diagrams throughout the rest of the unit. But now we're going to go in and look a little more specifically at the mechanisms of how evolution actually happens. And we're going to start focusing a little bit more on the genetics of evolution, which was the part that Darwin and Wallace didn't know anything about. They didn't know about DNA. They didn't know exactly how variation came to be or how those variations got passed on. And they admitted that those were things that they didn't know. Those were kind of the holes in their explanation. But that doesn't mean that what they said was wrong. They just couldn't fully explain the why of what they were seeing. So that's what we're going to start talking about now as we move into what is chapter 21 in your textbook. So what we're looking at here is the process of microevolution. What evolution actually is at a genetic level is a change in the frequency of the alleles in a population over generations. So it's a really important thing to realize that the process of natural selection, what we've been talking about so far, acts on an individual, right? One individual may have been lucky enough to have been born with a particular set of genes that gives it some trait that's advantageous in that environment. Out of my little cartoony fish, like maybe this fish and this fish are fast enough to escape predators, and so they survive better and reproduce more, right? That's natural selection, but that by itself is not evolution because these two fish haven't changed and their DNA hasn't changed. They just got lucky enough that they survive and they reproduce more, but because they reproduce more, they pass on the genes that make them faster and fastest. And so in the next generation of fish, we would expect to see more fish like these and less of the bottom two types of fish based on their genes. We'd expect to see a change in the frequency of those alleles from one generation to the next or over the course of a few generations. So evolution can only act on populations. That's the smallest biological unit that evolution can act on. One individual can't evolve. Evolution is a change in the entire population at the level of the genes that they actually have, okay? And we're going to be looking at that idea in more depth over the next couple days. This is called microevolution as opposed to macroevolution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But microevolution is changes in allele frequencies that can cause changes in the phenotypes or the behaviors of a species, but it doesn't necessarily immediately change it into a new species, right? It gives it a new trait, maybe it gives it a new color, a new shape, or a new speed, or whatever. But that alone doesn't necessarily make it a new species. Macroevolution looks more at those bigger changes. How do those branches of the tree actually diverge and become separate species? And we'll talk about that in just a couple days. We'll get to that part. But for now, we're just looking at how the process works on the small scale. How do these genetic changes happen over the course of multiple generations? So here you have an example of a population of little purple and blue flies. You can see the genotypes for this particular trait are listed on their body. I'd like you to turn and talk to somebody next to you real quick. Will this population evolve? And explain why or why not. What do you think? Will evolution happen in this population?
No.
Why not?
No genetic variation.
There's no variation. And I did hear you say, well, what if there's a mutation that could happen? True. But if there's no variation, evolution can happen, right? Genetic variation, that those differences that are inherent in living things are kind of the raw material that evolution has to work with. Evolution doesn't create genetic variation. It has to be there already. so that evolution has something to select. If everything's identical, then there's no reason other than random chance that one's going to survive better than any other. And so there isn't this process of change over time. The gene pool of this population can never change because there isn't anything for it to change to, unless there's something like a mutation or something that introduces some genetic variation. So where does that genetic variation come from? This might be pretty obvious, but it's an important starting point, because when we're talking about genetic change in a population, we have to think about the differences that we begin with. Some of this variation comes from the process of mutation. Mutations happen randomly throughout the entire genome all the time. Many of them are neutral. They don't really affect anything in how that organism functions for one reason or another. Many of them are harmful, and those mutations just disappear from the population because maybe that organism can't even function correctly or can't develop, or it just doesn't survive as well. But occasionally there are mutations that are beneficial in one way or another, and those tend to be the ones that get passed on and become adaptations. Genes can also get duplicated or rearranged. You might remember there was a slide at the end of our genetics unit where we looked at all the different chromosomal rearrangements, how bits of one chromosome can kind of change places with bits of another one. So big chunks of genetic material can also get moved around as well. That's another source of variation. And the process of sexual reproduction itself is kind of a mixing up of all of the genes within a population, both because the process of meiosis makes every egg cell and every sperm cell a little bit different to begin with. And then which egg cells and which sperm cells combine is also random. There's an element of randomness in there. And which individuals mate with which other individuals may not be totally random, but it also mixes up the genes within a population. So at a lot of different levels, the process of sexual reproduction creates new combinations of genes. And even if the genes themselves don't change, it might be advantageous to have a particular combination of traits in that environment. And I think I probably just talked about some of those. A whole bunch of different things within the process of sexual reproduction that can increase the variation. So if we think of evolution as a change in the allele frequency in a population over generations, this sounds like something. An allele frequency is a number. We can calculate what percentage of the alleles within a population are the dominant one and what percentage are the recessive one. And so if we can measure allele frequencies, maybe we can actually measure the process of evolution happening. And so some scientists, and especially mathematicians who like to think of things numerically, wanted to do this. They wanted to find a way to actually measure the change in allele frequencies within a population. And so this is kind of how they started. They said, okay, if evolution is possible, if it's possible for the allele frequencies in a population to change, it must also be possible for them to stay the same, right? For non-evolution to occur. So if we can figure out what makes populations stay the same versus what makes populations change in terms of the allele frequency, we should be able to give a mathematical definition for what evolution is. As a result of this process, they came up with an equation called the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium that we're going to learn about tomorrow. But for today, we're just going to look at kind of what they figured out as they tried to identify what causes evolution to happen, and therefore what has to not be happening to have non-evolution. They came up with 5 things, 5 ways that the allele frequency of a population can change. And that's what we're going to focus on here for kind of this last part of class today. We're going to watch a video. This is just 5 minutes long, but it's called The 5 Fingers of Evolution, and it gives a really good way to remember these 5 things. So what I would recommend, if you flip all the way to the back of your note packet, it's blank. I'd like you to take a minute and copy this chart on the back of your notes. The first column just says which finger, and what does it mean? This is going to go through and kind of give you a little device to help you remember using the 5 fingers on your hand and tell you what each one means. The middle column asks you just to give a short description, and the right-hand column asks you to give an example. As you watch this video, you're going to be filling in this chart kind of as part of your notes on the 5 different things that can cause evolution to happen.